Welcome to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. Legal issues simplified through real client stories and real-world experiences. Creating simplicity in 3, 2, 1.
Welcome back to another episode of Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd.
As a business and healthcare law firm, we are sometimes triggered by certain buzzwords our client will say in conversation. We know that there's potential disaster when we hear these words and are immediately on high alert. This season's theme, Brad, is red flags.
Do you think our audience has picked up on the fact that we're a little competitive?
I think we gave it away when we started keeping score on the number of times that we said ding during the episodes this season.
Ding, I'm on up.
Well, actually, it's 1-1, Brad, because I said ding right before you, and I just said it again, so now I'm up to 2-1. So let's move on, and let's tell a few of our favorite compete stories to really paint the picture on our competitive fire.
Whew. All right, so those in the audience probably have heard that one of our core values is compete, and I don't think we can go much further in this pod until we say we got to tell the chicken parmesan story in New York.
Ding. Brad, that may reveal a little too much about us.
You're probably right, but since, all right, audience, this is just between us, so do not repeat this. It's a bad case.
It's a secret.
It's a secret, yeah,
Okay.
So we don't want to. So we were in New York. We were there for a huge medical conference. It was you and I up there. And we were going to this Italian restaurant. We were meeting a bunch of our clients and some friends. There's probably a table of at least 10 or 12 of us.
Yeah, I remember my dad was there.
Yes. And so we had one of our family friends from New Orleans, Raviv, was there. Raviv has a hedge fund, and he had just sold, so he had a house in New Orleans, had a house in New York. And so he's like, oh, come visit us. I'll meet you up there. So he comes along. And he brought his date, and neither of us have ever met her before, and you actually never had met Ravi before. And we just started asking her about her life, and shocking news, I started quizzing people about who they were. Turns out that she was a former professional ballerina, and so she went on to explain about all the different productions in New York and London she was a part of, in New York Metropolitan Ballet. Basically, she was a big deal, but had no idea who we were.
Yeah, nor should she have. And probably, perhaps most embarrassingly, we had some of our largest clients at that dinner.
Yeah. And even though we happened to be sitting next to each other, unknowingly, we both had ordered the chicken parmesan.
And audience, I do not know how to adequately describe the size of the chicken parmesan that came. It was so big that the edges were hanging off the plate on both ends.
Yes. This was not a small plate either.
No.
This is not a small plate kind of place.
The best I can do is just, if you take like the shape of a college football and you deflated that college football and set it on a plate, I think that's what we both received.
Yeah, it might even be a jumbo-sized college football. So we started eating, and I was eating, and I felt like I was making no progress. And I remember debating internally whether it was just time to stop. And I noticed that you had quit. So you were just visiting with the ballerina, and I silently kept plugging away. And then all of a sudden I stopped and asked the ballerina, hey, have I eaten more than Michael? And she kind of looked at me like a dog when they kind of turn their head sideways, like, what did you just say? Like, could not believe what I just asked. So I had to ask it again. And she looked at both of our plates, and she confirmed that I had eaten more than you.
And let me just pause and acknowledge that Brad started this whole thing. He just admitted to it. So I'll confess what happened next now, but Brad started it.
Yeah.
I, in turn, started eating again after it was revealed that I was losing. and I kept plugging away until I perceived that I'd eaten more than Brad. And then I brought our judge, the ballerina, back in to get her to weigh in on who had eaten more chicken parm. And she very begrudgingly checked our plates again and confirmed that I had.
So unfortunately, audience, it went back and forth for some time. The rest of the table was living their lives, laughing and drinking and having wine. And we were acting like two contestants at a state fair eating contest. And we just kept pushing our limits, I think, to the point where I think we're both starting to feel sick.
at one point, finally, and mind you, my wife was on a plane flying to come meet
our
us.
wives weren't there yet.
Yes.
To scold us.
And so I knew that we were going to have to be functional and meet them and go out later.
Yeah.
And so we eventually decided just to call it even. Okay. I feel like I've got that weight off my shoulders now that we got the story out. It's a secret. But, Brad, I'll just give you a little bit of a platform right now. Tell the audience your favorite ridiculous story about you winning against me, not a tie.
How many episodes, Riley, do we have dedicated to my victories over Michael?
Ding.
Okay. One example, just one, I can top of my head. Our firm, we like to celebrate things, and so every year we celebrate our anniversary. We typically close the firm for about a half day. We go grab some Tex-Mex. We might have a libation or two, and it's always followed by some type of fun activity that we decide to do. One year, the firm had elected to go play putt-putt golf. That was not far from where our offices were. We broke up into different teams. It happened to be a warm day, and so I determined that my team needed a bucket of ice-cold brews to keep ourselves hydrated because it was hot, Michael, so hydration was important. And when I approached the first hole, the ground would just seem too warm to me, so I didn't want to put the beer down. So I played the entire course one-handed, never placing a beer on the ground. I had probably more than one doing that.
Yeah, I was going to say, we need
it was
some
18
true
holes.
confession. Yes.
Well, the hydration was going so well, and the flow of the one-handed golfer worked really well that I just basically dominated. It had several holes in one and dominated you and all the other teams. And so that was a day in which I just destroyed everyone. And, of course, I could tell the whole whirly ball wins that my team has accumulated too, but I think we'll save that for another day. Michael, since I got to tell my story, you can just now make up some story about winning against me.
First of all, that little whirly ball plug at the end kind of goes back to that. I'm not going to tell another story, but I'm going to tell you real quick that I won something else.
What?
Yeah.
Oh, you caught that.
So, yeah, since we have Brad accusing me of making up, and I'm not competitive at all, but I do want the truth to be out there. Riley, please post for our YouTube viewers the picture of me with medal from just not too long ago, this past Christmas season, me winning the ugly sweater contest at Christmas. And for those who can't see the picture, I, of course, won and have a medal to prove it.
You know, audience, I think y'all probably heard him, but yes, he did win for being ugly.
Touche. Okay, well, Brad, this is all fun and good and definitely revealing, probably a little bit of an overshare.
Yes.
But imagine if when we started this place, if we had signed an agreement with each other that says we can't compete with each other.
Oh, that would be so horrible. But Michael, nice transition to today's topic.
Thank you. I did a little bow. Our red flag buzzword we're talking about today deals with covenants not to compete. And the buzzword or the phrase we hear is non-competes are not enforceable.
Oh, my gosh. The classic locker room talk. So let's just jump into today's story, Michael.
So our story today is about an employed physician in private practice in Houston, Texas. We will call him Dr. Regret.
Ding. I thought we agreed to move on from the chicken parmesan incident.
We did.
Okay.
However, Dr. Regret signed his first employment agreement without having an attorney or even a friend review it with him.
Again. All right. We actually covered this scenario at the end of season 4, signing blindly physician employment agreements with Gary Tuma.
And today we'll specifically drill down and deal with how non-competes are not enforceable as a phrase can be a problem that will come back to haunt you.
Yeah, I probably should have dinged you while you were saying that again. We've heard that red flag statements way too many times.
Yes, yeah. And so a little backstory. Dr. Regret was a highly recruited dermatologist, had all the top training.
Nice.
His grand plan was to move his family home to Houston and start his own practice. For financial reasons, he decided to take a job with a large private equity-backed dermatology group to generate cash flow and to get settled before going out on his own.
Yeah, and we've touched on this before. We've heard the term derm roll-ups. Basically, when a private equity comes along, they've been acquiring medical practices for many years all across the country, and they're basically integrated into a much larger practice.
Yeah, the model's built around the idea of having a ton of employed physicians, and some of the models have a pathway for the physician to become an owner, but it's a little different than your traditional practice in that they become an owner in an MSO.
Oh, ding. Sorry. Ding. You, of all people, Michael, you just casually dropped this term, and you love context. So we've discussed this many times in the past, but the vocabulary word of the day so far is MSO. And for those who don't know, our loyal listeners probably do, Management Service Organization is what MSO stands for. And that's how non-physicians often can become involved in the medical practice enterprise.
Yeah. So obviously in a derm roll-up, that's we have private equity involved. That's going to be the model. The MSO is addressed in season 1, the painful discovery of the basics of med spa compliance. And we talk about ownership and the MSO in part 2 of that 2-part episode.
That's right. We did cover it at length. So Dr. Regret, he decides, as you said, to join this private equity derm group. So let's call them Dermatology Worldwide.
Nice. Yeah. You know I love the movie Step Brothers, and I cannot hear the term worldwide without thinking about Prestige Worldwide, the company that they founded. So let's roll with it. Yeah. Dermatology Worldwide presented Dr. Regret his employment agreement and informed him that this is the contract that all the doctors signed.
Oh, dang. This is straight out of don't even try to negotiate. This is how it works. And this is the playbook a lot of these larger organizations try. I'm just hoping that maybe Dr. Regret had listened to the podcast with Gary Truman when he was told he couldn't negotiate.
Well, Brad, his name is Dr. Regret. So we all know this does not end well. And I don't think that episode was out back when this happened. But that's a side note.
He can't go back in time?
Yes. Because Dr. Regret was going to be a short-timer, he did not see the need to pay someone to review his contract or run it past anyone. The only provision that mattered to him was the super strict non-compete.
Ding. Okay, lots of dings there. Non-compete, Michael, and their pure nature are supposed to be strict. So what does super strict mean?
Well, Brad, it means extra or more. But this non-compete, if you want to really know what it was, would prohibit him from practicing medicine within 60 miles of any Dermatology Worldwide location for 3 years after he left the practice.
All right, ding. You got to be. You're not kidding, right? That is super strict. Okay, I'll go with you on this one. And this is in Texas, and physician non-competes in Texas, they can be allowed, but they have to have a buyout clause. So did Dr. Regret have one of those?
Yes, it did have a buyout. He could buy out of the non-compete for $600,000, and this was 2 times his base salary.
Okay, well, that's somewhat normal in some capacity. So he recognized the non-compete was important to him. Why didn't he hire an attorney to help him?
His best friend in California had told him non-competes are not enforceable.
Ding, ding.
Why the double ding?
Okay, well, we already started this. All right, there's this staff room, locker room talk that always seems to get people in trouble. And it's about as reliable, probably going to Wikipedia and trying to find out your information for your term paper. Whatever the subject matter is, you have no idea if it's actually real information.
Well, and this particular statement is common, and we hear it from the young physicians and sometimes even the older ones.
Yeah, and the reason why I did a second ding is that for our audience to understand, it is a state law issue. Non-competes are, in fact, as his friend said, unenforceable in California. But they are allowed in Texas if the non-compete meets certain criteria that is written out. I won't get into that.
Exactly. So Dr. Regret signed his contract with a super strict non-compete, and in his mind, it was unenforceable.
Oh, dang him.
So we came into the picture when
Oh.
Dr. Regret was wanting help to start his new practice. And he kind of threw in at the end, hey, do you mind checking out my contract where I'm currently at as part of this, just to make sure, it's got a non-compete in it. I think he didn't use the word super strict. He's like, it's got a non-compete in it. But I've heard those are not enforceable. And so he asked us to help.
Well, hopefully, dermatology worldwide was laid back about their non-competes.
Well, Brad, it turns out that the private equity group that had invested $100 million plus into the Texas roll-up was, in fact, not that laid back about it. Yeah. In fact, they were quite the opposite of laid back.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, that's not really a surprise to us. So what happened?
So, of course, we're in the midst of trying to get Dr. Regret's entities set up, and we review this, and we said, okay, well, let's talk. We got some risks here. And, we did talk about the fact that, hey, this is, probably outside the bounds of normal for a non-compete, but, there's non-competes are enforceable in Texas, and, there's some serious risk here. And so after weighing all that, I think Dr. Regret continued to live up to his name and decided to go with the head in the sand strategy.
Ding.
And decided he wasn't going to approach or negotiate with dermatology worldwide. He was just going to leave, put in proper notice, and go forward with opening his practice inside the super strict non-compete zone.
Oh, that's do we have a gong ding I could hit so loud? But maybe that would hurt our audience's ears.
Yes, Brad, I'll ding your ding.
Okay.
I'll raise you a ding. It did not go well for Dr. Regret. He was sued.
What?
Yes. And then he had to hire litigation counsel to defend him. Now, here's the good news, Brad. The court agreed that the restraint on trade is kind of a legal buzzword, but when they're saying looking at the 60 miles, they agreed that was unreasonable.
Well, for our audience, it probably sounds like a great result, meaning that the non-compete was unenforceable.
Not so much. The court lessened the non-compete to 20 miles and 2 years through the reformation clause in the contract.
Ding for using legal jargon, Michael. All right, so we got our next vocabulary word, which is reformation clause. This is a clause in a contract that actually allows the judges to modify certain pieces, in this case, the non-competes. And so if they say it's too restrictive, then they can just kind of make it so that it's not as restrictive, so it could still be enforceable. So a lot of states, you might hear the term, it's called the blue pencil law, but basically allows the judge to update the document to make it legal.
Yes. And just to have a little frame of reference on what that journey looked like, Dr. Regret spent close to $100,000 litigating his non-compete.
Ouch, man. Did the reduction in the mileage help him with his new practice?
Again, Brad, his name's Dr. Regret. So no. Dr. Regret had signed a long-term lease. When I say long-term, a 10-year lease for his new practice about 10 miles from the office where he had worked.
I don't know if I'm supposed to say double ouch or double ding. So what did he do?
Well, he borrowed money from the bank to stroke a check for the $600,000 buyout of the non-compete, because remember, it had that provision in there. And so all told, he spent about $700,000 to leave that practice instead of the few thousand if he had just hired someone to help him on the front end.
That is unbelievable. Michael, let's go to commercial, and on the other side, let's talk about the enforceability issues that we've somewhat raised with the dings on the non-competes.
Many business owners use legal counsel as a last resort rather than as a proactive tool that can further their success. Why? For most, it's the fear of unknown legal costs. ByrdAdatto's Access Plus program makes it possible for you to get the ongoing legal assistance you need for one predictable monthly fee. That gives you unlimited phone and email access to the legal team, so you can receive feedback on legal concerns as they arise, Access Plus, a smarter, simpler way to access legal services. Find out more. Visit ByrdAdatto.com today.
Welcome back to Legal 123s with ByrdAdatto. I'm your host, ByrdAdatto, with my co-host, Michael Byrd. Now, Michael, this season's theme is red flags. Why is this locker room talk out there about these non-competes being not enforceable?
Like many things, there are, with this particular kind of reputation out there, is that there are strands of truth that kind of have evolved through the years, kind of like the game of telephone.
Yeah.
So non-competes are controversial, and even in some states, they are not enforceable. But somehow what's evolved is just this common perception as a blanket statement that non-competes are not enforceable.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Oh, wait, cut that out. Sorry. It is a game of telephone. And like in this story, they hear that non-competes are not enforceable, and they just wrongly assume every state has to be the same, right? And, I've actually heard clients that just had a meeting state the same thing. Or they said, oh, well, I just heard that since President Biden signed that executive order, non-competes are therefore not enforceable anymore, which is, again, audience, not correct. So let's talk about the reality, which, of course, is more complicated. And so when we discuss these things with the clients, we often say, look, there's a risk involved, and everybody has different risks. And we've talked about this, but your risk tolerance really is, are you afraid to step out of the shower in the morning? Or are you the kind of person that jumps out of an airplane, right? Those are two very different risk tolerance. And so when you're looking at a non-compete, they need to understand the risk associated. And I think one of the things we've talked about before is just because it might not be unenforceable, or maybe that when you look at it, doesn't mean that they won't try to enforce it.
Yeah, I mean, I try to explain the risk. I use the analogy of a non-compete with playing poker.
And audience, Michael loves playing poker.
I do love playing poker.
That's where the compete comes out hardcore.
Yes. And so if you think about a poker game, the validity of your position in whatever state you're in are the cards that you're dealt.
Yep.
So you sign a contract, it's got a non-compete. And if that state is like California, you may have a nicer hand than if you're in a different state.
Sure.
But those are your cards.
Yeah.
The second element are the stack of chips you have to play the game. Now, as Dr. Regret learned when he spent $100,000 to stay in the poker hand, that poker can be quite expensive.
Yes.
And litigation's expensive. Yeah. And so this isn't some random offshoot that he spent $100,000. That's actually really common, that that kind of fight to stay in the game is going to cost a lot. Now, if you're the departing physician going up against a practice, guess who has the bigger stack most often?
Ooh,
yes.
Yes.
And so you have to deal with that element of, are you going to stay in the fight, or are you going to fold them to move on to live another day? And then the third element in the poker game are the players themselves. You talked about this just a moment ago with risk tolerance of everyone.
Yeah.
If you are Dr. Regret and you're dealing with private equity, I think they've probably played poker before.
Yeah.
And they weren't going to back down.
No.
We have some other clients who we know that the employer physician is very conflict averse, and by reputation, maybe even past experiences, won't fight the fight.
Mm-hmm.
And that's relevant.
Yeah.
When you're evaluating what to do. So, that's a way to big picture kind of think about the non-compete. And while we're talking about poker, I am better than Brad.
Ding. I thought we said we weren't going to talk about how our competition was to be taking out of this, but okay. Using poker analogy, you laid out literally the cards, and so how does someone know if you have a strong or a weak non-compete?
Yeah, this is difficult. So, I mean, in some states it might be easy because California is clear that non-competes are not enforceable. And so, if you've signed one, then the employer has a weak hand.
Yep.
But they do have a hand.
Yes.
And so the way to think about what you have to look at is you look at, first of all, the contract itself.
Yeah.
And how is the law written in that particular state.
Sure.
And so In Texas, for example, the Supreme Court has bolstered the enforceability of non-competes. The appellate courts have. And so non-compete law is well and good. So the first thing you do is you look at the actual contract,
Yes.
compare it to the law,
Yes.
and you kind of understand how your hand looks.
Yeah.
Here, he didn't have a great hand. He had a decent hand because of the 60 miles and 3 years,
Yeah.
but there's a reformation clause in there.
Ooh, yeah.
So you have to weigh that. And then here's the outlier is that the state courts, the courts where you go before the judge, often can't stand non-competes.
Yeah.
And so they're the ones looking in the eyeballs of an employee who will be displaced from working. And a lot of times they'll just say, hey, I don't care what the law says. I'm not going to keep this person out of the job. And so it brings a new balance to that risk, in this case, just talking about Texas, but looking at it from both perspectives. And it's kind of gotten to the point where I don't care if I'm talking to an employer or an employee in Texas, and I'll just say, hey, it's a coin flip.
Yeah. So, it's messy, Michael, and this triggers a lot of other conversations. But when it comes to signing, a contract and it has a non-compete, you're basically saying that they're going to have to do a coin flip. So about cases like doctored regret, what happens when you have this aggressive non-compete?
Well, Dr. Regret is a classic example that there is no such thing as no risk, even though he thought, with his blanket statement, they're not enforceable, because even, a non-compete written in a state that would consider it unenforceable, it has a cost to it, right?
Yeah, it sure does.
So even if he didn't have a reformation clause that ended up hurting him, he would have spent $100,000
just to get there,
to get his justice.
Yeah.
And unfortunately for him, it did have a reformation clause.
Yeah.
And so again, just using the analogy, you have to pay to play.
Hmm.
And if you allow a non-compete in the contract with the thought that it's unenforceable, you have signed on for a future poker game. And so you better build up your stack of chips.
So 2 follow-up questions. Number 1, does Dr. Regret ever want to play poker with me? And number 2, don't answer that one. Let's strike that from the record.
Mm-hmm.
How is Dr. Regret doing? This sounds like I've been pretty hard so far.
Well, believe it or not, he has a great practice.
Awesome.
And a great life lesson. He actually hired his first physician recently and included a non-compete. I didn't smirk too big when I was on that call.
Yes.
More importantly, he's an Access Plus member and calls us to help him regularly than trying to do things on his own. So, Brad, let's wrap this episode up. What final thoughts do you have?
Well, a lot of people, they forget, Michael, why would you have a non-compete? So I'm glad that you're summing up that, as someone who lived through a non-compete fight, he would then realize the importance of a non-compete. Non-competes can be extremely useful tools for many business, including medical practices. It helps protect the value they build up in their enterprise. This can be their goodwill, their trade secrets, helping retain employees so they don't go off and go to this direct competitor. And obviously, it enables the practice or the employer to benefit over long-term periods of time. And as we said often, in many cases, the states will allow it if they're correctly drafted. So non-competes, for the audience, can be enforceable, and sometimes they're necessary for the betterment of the business.
You raised some great points, and that is just not to for the audience to walk away thinking non-competes are bad. They have their place.
Right.
And so I think my takeaway is just that, hey, deal with this on the front end and identify, whichever side you're on. Is this something that's important and valuable to you and what you're trying to accomplish? And if there's a disconnect, that's what negotiations are for. And so you won't inadvertently find yourself in a chicken parm eating contest to the point of getting sick and not really feeling like going out with the wives afterwards.
Oh, yes, that's a good point. Well, Michael, guess what? Next week is our final show of season 7. It's going to be awesome. So you got to bring your A game because we're talking about red flags, one-page contracts. Thanks again for joining us today. And remember, if you like this episode, please subscribe. Make sure to give us a 5-star rating and share with your friends.
You can also sign up for the ByrdAdatto newsletter by going to our website at ByrdAdatto.com.
ByrdAdatto is providing this podcast as a public service. This podcast is for educational purposes only. This podcast does not constitute legal advice, nor does it establish an attorney-client relationship. Reference to any specific product or entity does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by ByrdAdatto. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. Please consult with an attorney on your legal issues.